everyone. Good day. This is Melիссою Джой Еста from the Philippines. Last time I had a short video message of expressing my support to the country of Ukraine. So through this video, I will be sharing with you about the life of Stepan Bandera. So who is Stepan Bandera? What did he do? And why is he considered a hero in Ukraine? I will be reading you the story about his life. So Stepan Bandera, his life and struggle. So when Stepan Bandera was born in Stary, West Ukraine, on January 1, 1909, as the son of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic priest Andriy Bandera, Ukraine was under the rule of two empires. The Eastern religions, together with Volhynia, Kholm, and Podlysia, belonged to Russia, whilst the West regions, Galicia, Transcarpathia, and Bukovina, were part of Austria-Hungary and were administered with the help of the Poles. In spite of this partition, however, the demands of the Ukrainians for national and social liberation in all their territories become more and more insistent. The springtide of the peoples of 1848 had also spread to Ukraine, and the seeds that it had sown germinated and throve, nurtured in every sphere of life of the Ukrainian people by the prominent Ukrainian personalities, politicians, scientists, artists, and clergymen. This seed ripened fully in the stormy years of the First World War, when the independent Ukrainian National Republic was established in Kiev, year 1917 to 1918, and the West Ukrainian People's Republic, which 3 months later became part of the All-Ukrainian state, was founded in the West Ukrainian territories in November 1918. These important events in the history of Ukrainian people had a decisive influence of the awakening of national political consciousness of the 10-year-old Stepan Bandera, as he later stated in his autobiography. But the joy of the Ukrainians at attaining their independence was only short-lived. During the early days of its existence, the young state was already obliged to defend its independence against 4 enemies: the Russians, Poles, Romanians, and Czechs, by armed force. After a year of heavy combat against the Poles, the Ukrainian Galician army, owing to lack of weapons and equipment, was obliged to retreat across the river Zbruch and abandon the West Ukrainian territories to the Poles. With the army chaplain, and the deputy of the West Ukrainian Parliament, Andriy Bandera, also left his native country, and thus Stepan Bandera, at an early age, came to know the tragic lot of the homeless after his family fled before the brutality of the Poles. After the mandate granted by the Entente on June 25, 1919, Poland occupied the West Ukrainian territories and enforced a ruthless occupation regime there. By June 1919, more than 250,000 of the 3.5 million Ukrainians in Galicia were confined in Polish prisons and internment camps as prisoners, as this number also included 1,000 clergymen. The Warsaw paper Robotnik stated in its edition of October 16, 1919, "The conditions which prevail in the camps of Modlin and Brest-Litovsk are a disgrace to the Polish state. Thousands of prisoners of war and civilians died. Ukrainian property to the value of milliards was pillaged and destroyed. Ukrainian cultural achievements were annihilated, and the Ukrainian population of Galicia was in danger of being exterminated. Such was the state of affairs. Such was the state of affairs at the beginning of Polish rule in the West Ukrainian territories. A year later, East Ukraine suffered an even heavier blow under Russian Bolshevist occupation. But the Ukrainian people did not submit resignedly to their fate. In the central and eastern regions of Ukraine, countless insurrections continued to break out for years, and the Russian occupants had hard work to crush them. In the West Ukrainian territories, which after the Polish-Russian Treaty in Riga were occupied by Poland, the Ukrainian military organization, the Ukrainian Sikh Infantry, was formed. This military organization, under the experienced leadership of the military expert and politician Colonel Ivan Konovalets, developed a lively underground activity. By means of armed insurrections against representatives of Polish rule, assassinations, destructions of Polish landed property and estates, and the dissemination of propaganda literature, the UVO, in an active and concrete manner, gave the Ukrainian people moral support in their independence aims, brought about the restriction of Polish interference and atrocities, and, in addition, did its share in informing and warning the rest of the world that this disregard of human rights would lead to a dreadful catastrophe. Because of its courageous action, the UVO won the sympathy and support of the Ukrainian youth, who deeply felt the subjugation and humiliation of the Ukrainian people. Young people at school began to organize secret groups and cells, which were based on the ideological principles of the UVO, whose members were trained in the national revolutionary spirit to become fighters and champions of the cause of freedom of Ukraine. At the same time, the purpose of these groups was to appeal to the Ukrainian population to give its active support to the revolutionary underground movement. This support included, amongst other measures, donations for the secret Ukrainian University in Lviv, the circulation of Ukrainian publications printed abroad, which were prohibited by the Poles, the boycotting of Polish societies, as well as the boycotting of the census and the elections for the first Polish Sejm, or parliament. Stepan Bandera, a pupil in the fourth form of the grammar school in Stry, also joined one of these secret youth groups. In addition to physically hardening himself in the Boy Scouts and in the Sokil Sports Society, he acquired in this secret nationalist group the moral and ideological principles which were later to have such a decisive influence on his course in life. Because of his exceptional intelligence and talent, his good qualities of character, his spirit of comradeship, sense of duty and modesty, and his happy disposition, he was outstanding amongst his schoolmates of the same age. After passing his school leaving examination in 1927, Stepan Bandera intended to go to Czechoslovakia in order to study at the Ukrainian College of Technology and Economics in Podebrady, but the Polish authorities refused to give him a permit to leave the country. It is interesting to note that the Polish authorities in the West Ukrainian territories showed no political farsightedness at all in this respect, a fact which undoubtedly also explains the increasing strength of the Ukrainian revolutionary liberation movement. Thus, Stepan Bandera too withdrew for some time to the village where his father, who had meanwhile returned from the East Ukraine, lived, and here he took an active part in cultural and educational work. In 1928, he returned to Lviv and began studying the only faculty of the technical college open to Ukrainians, the Department of Agriculture. During his studies, he devoted all his spare time and energy to the revolutionary activity, which captured him more and more. After having become a member of the UVO in the same year, he met a number of former schoolmates and other leading representatives of the Ukrainian liberation movement in Lviv, whose names were later also to become known abroad. As for instance, Stepan Okremovich, at that time chairman of the Home Executive Committee of the OUN, Ivan Gabrusevic, later perished in the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen, Stepan Lenkavsky, the present chairman of the units abroad of the OUN, Jaroslav Statsko, who became Prime Minister of the Ukrainian government in 1941 and now is President of Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, or also known as ABN. Roman Shukevich, later Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, and famous under the name of General Taras Chuprinka, Dmitro Hritsey, General Peribdenis, Chief of Staff of the UPA, and numerous other persons who were later to become prominent. Together with them and other comrades, Stepan Bandera planned the activity of the liberation movement. The Ukrainian military organization under the leadership of Colonel Evan Konovalets did not limit its armed action merely to the West Ukrainian territories. Its liaison men also penetrated into the eastern territories of Ukraine, where they set up a network of resistance groups and even won supporters amongst the members of the Officers Training School of the Red Army in Kiev. It was the aim of the UVO to include all classes of the Ukrainian population in its activity in order to carry out a general armed insurrection when the time was right. But the organizational structure of the UVO was not large enough to encompass the active participation of the masses. The Ukrainian youth followed the example of the older generation of the Ukrainian patriots who had founded the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, the SVU, and now formed the Union of Ukrainian Youth, the SUM. The discovery of these two underground organizations by the Russians led to mass arrests and to the liquidation of the elite of the Ukrainian people. In the meantime, the numerous secret nationalist groups and organizations in West Ukraine united, and in 1929, the first Congress of the Ukrainian Nationalists, which took place in Vienna, founded the Organization of the Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, and elected Colonel Evan Konovalets hitherto head of the UVO, as chairman. The UVO was gradually assimilated in the military section of the OUN. The OUN owed its development and strength to its founders, whose names we have mentioned before, and in particular to Stepan Bandera, whose outstanding qualities as an organizer and a leader had a chance to develop to the full during years 1928 to 1933. Since he was constantly in contact with Colonel Convalets, who at the time was abroad, Stepan Bandera was able to realize the plan for the development and expansion of the national liberation movement, which he and his closest co-workers had drawn up. The OUN now began to extend its organization network and to increase its cadres in all the Ukrainian territories under Polish rule, and abroad. Particular importance was attached to the West Ukrainian territories, which were threatened by the communist subversion. In order to consolidate the power of the organization, it now included in its activity the masses of the farming and working classes, who saw in the OUN their protector and champion of the fight for freedom. In training its members, the OUN attached underground tactics, conspiring and reconnaissance, etc. In addition to political propaganda attacks and campaigns within the scope of the organization, the OUN members also developed a form of activity, namely mass campaigns on the part of the Ukrainian population. At the initiative and instructions of the OUN, the Ukrainian population carried out an anti-monopoly and a school campaign. In order to achieve a moral and political effect, the Ukrainian population, at the initiative of the OUN, boycotted the purchase of goods under the state monopoly. This campaign was a big success, and the Polish state suffered considerable financial losses. In addition to its revolutionary activity against the Polish oppressors of West Ukraine, the OUN also began a fight for freedom on the second front, anti-Bolshevist fight in all the Ukrainian territories. In West Ukraine, the OUN conducted its campaign in two directions: against the Communist Party of the West Ukraine, its propaganda and agents from the USSR, as well as against the diplomatic representatives of Bolshevist Russia and Sovietophile trend. In a relatively short time, the OUN, with the assistance of the masses, succeeded in breaking down Bolshevist diversion maneuvers in Ukraine. During World War II, these territories became the base for the fight of the Ukrainian Revolutionary Liberation Movement against Russian Bolshevist rule in the central and eastern territories of Ukraine. By means of attack on Soviet diplomats, as for instance the famous attack on Mailov in the Soviet consulate in Lviv, and leading communist functionaries, the OUN demonstrated the unity of the Ukrainian Liberation Front and the solidarity of the West Ukrainians with the anti-Bolshevist fight in the central and eastern territories. At the same time, these measures were also a protest against a famine which had been artificially created by Moscow in order to force the Ukrainian farmers to accept the system of collectivism. About 6 million Ukrainians died during this artificially created famine. You see? During his trial before the court in Warsaw in 1936, Stepan Bandera defined the fundamental motives of the anti-Bolshevist fight conducted by the OUN and said, "We are fighting communism not only by the means of propaganda but also with armed force. Since communism is fighting Ukrainian nationalism with the aid of a hitherto unheard of ruthless physical mass terrorism, namely by mass executions in the Cheka and GPU prisons, by starving millions of people, and by ceaseless deportations to Siberia. By means of the system of Bolshevism, Moscow has destroyed the Ukrainian state and has subjugated the Ukrainian people." In 1933, Stepan Bandera was appointed chairman of the executive of the OUN in Ukraine. It was during this period that the OUN reached the height of its development. December 30, 1933, the Polish journal Melodic published an article entitled "At the 11th Hour," which contained the following comments on the OUN. Okay. The secret OUN, or Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, is today stronger than all the Ukrainian legal parties together. So OUN is so much stronger than all the legal parties in Ukraine at that time. It rules the youth, it governs public opinion, and it is unceasingly active in order to draw the masses into the eddy of a revolution. It is now perfectly obvious that time is against us. Every starosta, or Polish district officer, in Little Poland, or also known as Galicia, and in Volhynia can enumerate the villages which until a short time ago were passive and now, stirred up by anti-state campaigns, are ready and eager to fight. The enemy is becoming stronger and stronger, and the Polish state weaker and weaker. Polish was playing a losing game in spite of ruthless measures of oppression to which she resorted in dealing with members of the Ukrainian underground. Other Ukrainians too, who were not members of the OUN, were sentenced to 8 to 12 years imprisonment by the Polish courts if any illegal literature was found in their possession. But all these measures did not deter the Ukrainian youth from taking part in the fight for freedom. In order to prevent the continuation of Polish colonization in the West Ukrainian territories, the OUN carried out a sabotage campaign against the Polish landowners and settlers and set fire to their estates, farms, and granaries. By way of retaliation, the Polish government resorted to ruthless measures, which became known as pacification against the Ukrainian farmers. The dreadful terrorism of the punitive expeditions of the Polish army and police at that time occupied the headlines in the world press. The Manchester Guardian of November 22, 1935, commented at some length on the pacification measures and on Piraki, who, under the Skladkovsky government year 1930, was the police chief responsible for these measures and who later became Minister of the Interior. The same paper pointed out that the Ukrainians badly endured the Polish pressure with admirable passivity until extremist groups had finally begun to set fire to the estates of the Polish landowners. By way of retaliation, units of the Polish army and police had then raided Ukrainian villages and had arrested farmers there at random and beaten them. The Manchester Guardian added that these operations had been carried out in secret, but that there could now be no doubt whatever that these were the most drastic measures of oppression ever heard of in the history of the civilized world. The said paper emphasized that there was no exact information as to how many farmers had been beaten, but careful estimates assessed the number of about 10,000, all of whom had been innocent. As a result of the ill treatment they had received, many of the farmers were ill in bed for weeks afterwards, and some of them died of the injuries they had received. On December 3, 1935, the same paper stated that Minister Piraki had been responsible for the pacification carried out in East Galicia in the year 1930, and that he had likewise been responsible for the pacification in the region of Lisco in the year 1931, and for that in Volhynia and Policia in 1932, about which the Polish press at the Manchester Guardian pointed out had not mentioned a word. The paper added that his pacifying speeches were merely intended to conceal the atrocities for which he and his government were responsible from the rest of the world. In reply to the Polish measures of the oppression, Stepan Bandera organized a counter-campaign including an attempt on the life of the Minister of Interior Piraki. This was carried out successfully by Matseko, a member of the OUN, who subsequently fled abroad. The Polish police thereupon carried out mass arrests amongst the Ukrainian population, and in the course of investigations discovered the headquarters of the OUN in the West Ukrainian territories. In the year 1934, Stepan Bandera was arrested, and at the beginning of 1936, he was sentenced to death in Warsaw as being responsible for the entire activity of the UVO and OUN. This sentence was later commuted to imprisonment for life. In the autumn of the same year, he was once more sentenced to imprisonment for life in Lviv. The Ukrainian people and the OUN suffered a number of heavy blows during the years that followed. The OUN chairman for all Ukraine was imprisoned in solitary confinement in the most securely guarded prison in Poland and was completely isolated from the outside world. In 1938, the founder and leader of the OUN, Colonel Evan Konovalets, was murdered in Rotterdam by a Bolshevist bomb. One might have assumed that the revolutionary movement, whose ranks had been decimated by the Polish mass arrests, would now cease to exist, or would at least, for a time, limit its activity. But it very soon became obvious that this movement was so deeply rooted in the hearts of the Ukrainian population that it could only be eradicated by exterminating the entire Ukrainian people. In spite of the fact that all the members of the OUN leadership had been arrested, there were still enough and other leading members of the OUN who were prepared to continue the uncompromising fight against the enemy. This was only too apparent when the state of Czechoslovakia, which had been artificially created in Versailles under German pressure, disintegrated into its natural parts. That is to say, when an independent Carpato Ukraine was formed. From the underground fight, the Ukrainian people, under the leadership of the OUN, passed to creative state activity. Contrary to Hitler's plans, Carpato Ukraine did not bow to German pressure and refused to submit the Hungarians without a fight. Fighting on two fronts, namely against the Hungarian and Poles, Carpato Ukraine on March 15, 1939, proclaimed its independence. In the foremost rank of fighters for the freedom of Carpato Ukraine, there were OUN members from every district of Ukraine. The German-Polish War, which broke out some months later, also brought considerable changes for the Ukrainian people. Russia had occupied Volhynia, Policia, and Galicia, whilst the region of Lemki, Kholm, and Podlysia under German occupation became part of the so-called general government. With the change in political conditions, the form of the Ukrainian fight for freedom also changed. The ranks of the OUN swelled anew when countless members were released from the Polish prisons and from the concentration camp in Bereza, Kartuska. The reinforced OUN now began to set up combat groups again, which took over the task of protecting the Ukrainian population and setting up ammunition depots for the future fight against Bolshevist Russia. As regards Germany, the OUN adopted an attitude of temporization. It was convinced that sooner or later a conflict would ensue between Nazi Germany and Bolshevist Russia. Upon the arrival of the Ukrainian troops in Lviv, where the Bolshevist NKVD had left behind dreadful traces of their rule, the restoration of the independent Ukrainian state was proclaimed on June 30, 1941, and a provisional government was set up. It consisted of representatives of various political trends and was headed by the Jaroslaw Stadsko, a member of the OUN. The proclamation of the restoration of the Ukrainian state was an event of national rejoicing. Moreover, the two highest dignitaries of the Ukrainian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholic Church, Bishop Polycarp and Metropolitan Count Andreas Sheptetsky, gave the proclamation their blessing. But the independent policy of the OUN and its proclamation had crossed Hitler's plans with regard to Ukraine. Consequently, mass arrests were carried out. To begin with, certain circles of the German High Command were in favor of the idea of an independent Ukrainian state, which they thought would be an ally. They were, however, powerless to influence Hitler's policy. Stepan Bandera was at first interned by the Gestapo, but he refused to deny his participation in the proclamation. He was immediately arrested. Stepan Bandera was at first interred by the Gestapo, but when he refused to deny his participation in the proclamation, he was immediately arrested. The Gestapo took him to Berlin, where they put him into prison. He was later transferred to the concentration camp in Sachsenhausen. In Lviv, the Gestapo arrested Jaroslaw Stetsko and various members of his government when they refused to resign and revoke the proclamation. On September 15, 1941, the Gestapo arrested over 2,000 Ukrainian nationalists in Ukraine who had participated in some way or other in setting up the Ukrainian state. The present leader of the units abroad of the OUN, Stepan Lenkavsky, and the 100 leading members of the OUN, including Bandera's two brothers, were taken to the concentration camp in Auschwitz or else put into prison or shot. Bandera's two brothers were murdered in Auschwitz, and his brother-in-law was tortured to death in the prison of Lviv. The Ukrainian Legion, under the command of Roman Shukevich, protested against the terrorism of the Gestapo. It was thereupon withdrawn from the front, and measures were taken to arrest its commanding officers. Roman Shukevich and many of his comrades, however, managed to escape in time and went into hiding in the underground movement. And once more, it seemed as if Ukrainian people, wedged in between two power blocks, would have to submit to their fate. With the assistance of the Gestapo, Hitler's governor in the Reich Commissariat of Ukraine, Erich Koch, began to depopulate Ukraine by means of mass deportations of the Ukrainian population to Germany for the purpose of forced labor, mass arrest, and also a famine ensued. The members of the OUN once more resorted to underground activity. They already possessed completely worked out plans for the revolutionary fight for freedom and for defense measures. Within a short time that they started their counteraction. The members of the OUN once more resorted to underground activity. They already possessed completely worked out plans for the revolutionary fight for freedom and for defense measures. Within a short time, they started their counteraction. At the end of 1941 and beginning of 1942, the first defense units were set up in the course of time, and they developed into a truly insurgent army. Roman Shukevich, who became famous under the name of General Taras Chuprinka, became the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or also known as UPA. The latter eventually numbered 200,000 well-equipped and trained soldiers who occupied large areas of Ukraine. The UPA enjoyed the wholehearted support of the Ukrainian people, who regarded it as their protector and defender, not only against Nazi terrorism, but also against the onslaughts of Bolshevist partisan units. In 1943, a secret conference of the representatives of the people who were subjugated by the Germany and Russia was held in Ukraine. This conference laid the foundation of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, ABN. A year later, 1944, the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, UHVR, the revolutionary government of Ukraine, was founded. It consisted of leading representatives of various political trends and played a decisive part in determining the course of the fight for freedom. At the end of 1944, when there was no longer any doubt about the fact that Germany would lose the war, the Gestapo released Stepan Bandera, Jaroslaw Stetsko, Stepan Lenkavsky, and many other members of the OUN from the concentration camps. In his hopeless situation, the German politicians made a last attempt to remedy the errors which they committed at the beginning of the war. They tried to convince the Ukrainian nationalists of the necessity of a collaboration with Germany. But the OUN refused to allow itself to be taken by the German wishes and promises, and, together with the UPA, continued its fight against Bolshevist Russia. With the help of France, the members of the OUN who had been liberated from the protection of the Gestapo managed to get through to the West and waited there for the war to end. For Ukraine, which once more fell under the Bolshevist rule, the fight did not, however, end with the Germany's capitulation. The Ukrainian people and the UPA soldiers continued their fight, which is indeed unparalleled in history, against the Bolshevist oppressors. Without allies, without reinforcements, and without any support at all from the free world, the Ukrainian insurgent army for years continued its heroic fight until the year 1952 against a major power which had seized half Europe and Asia. The proportions which this fight assumed can be seen from the fact that in 1947, Russia was forced to make a pact with Poland and Czechoslovakia regarding joint measures to combat the UPA. In the course of this relentless fight, the OUN and the UPA suffered heavy losses. Even after the heroic death of the commander-in-chief of the UPA, Roman Sukevich, on March 5, 1950, the Ukrainian people and the UPA continued their fight for freedom. The UPA was obliged to alter its fighting tactics, however, and had to resort to the underground activity once more instead of open fighting. As a result of the renewed Russian occupation of Ukraine, countless Ukrainians of all social classes were forced to leave their native country and immigrate. As exiles abroad, they met many members of the OUN once more, who had been released from the concentration camps and prisons. Under the leadership of Stepan Bandera, they united to form the units abroad of the OUN. The main task of the units abroad of the OUN became the general support in every way of fighting Ukraine. The units abroad extended their organization network to cover all the countries of the free world in which Ukrainian immigrants had settled. They established constant contact with the leadership of the OUN, of the free world, of the Ukrainian fight for freedom, and on the threat to the whole free world by Bolshevist Russia. At the initiative of the units abroad of the OUN, the activity of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations was resumed, and 16 people of East Europe and Asia, subjugated by Moscow and on friendly terms with Ukraine, joined this organization as members. Jaroslav Stetsko, the former prime minister of the Ukrainian government of 1941, was elected president of the Central Committee of the ABN. In 15 years' untiring activity, he had succeeded in gaining new friends and supporters for the Ukrainian liberation movement. In the internal Ukrainian sector of the Ukrainian immigration, the OUN strengthened the anti-Russian and anti-Bolshevist front, exposed the activity of enemy agents, and warded off dangerous alien denationalization influences. Regardless of social and political differences amongst the Ukrainian immigrants, countless groups have supported the OUN and in this way also fight for freedom of the Ukrainian people at home. Proof of this support is the Liberation Fund, which has enabled the OUN to conduct a liberation policy free. Proof of its in the internal Ukrainian sector of the Ukrainian immigration, the OUN strengthened the anti-Russian and anti-Bolshevist front, exposed the activity of enemy agents, and warded off dangerous alien denationalization influences. Regardless of social and political differences amongst the Ukrainian immigrants, countless groups have supported the OUN and in this way also fight for the freedom of the Ukrainian people at home. Proof of this support is the Liberation Fund, which has enabled the OUN to conduct a liberation policy free of all foreign influence during the past 17 years. The lively activity of the OUN amongst the immigrants and the name of Stepan Bandera, who became the symbol of the fight for freedom. The lively activity of the OUN amongst the immigrants and the name of Stepan Bandera, who became the symbol of the fight for freedom, eventually come to be regarded by Moscow as a danger and a threat. In addition to its ruthless extermination of the Ukrainian people, Moscow, for 15 years, endeavored to exterminate the spokesman and champion of the Ukrainian independence aspirations, Stepan Bandera. Since his name had become the symbol of freedom in every region of the Russian people's prison, from the Sun to Sakhalin and Kamchatka. The lively activity of the OUN amongst the immigrants and the name of Stepan Bandera, who became the symbol of the fight for freedom, eventually come to be regarded by Moscow as a danger and a threat. In addition to its ruthless extermination of the Ukrainian people, Moscow, for 15 years, endeavored to exterminate the spokesman and champion of the Ukrainian independence aspirations, Stepan Bandera. Since his name had become the symbol of freedom in every region of the Russian people's prison, from the Sun to Sakhalin and Kamchatka, amongst all classes of the population, in the Red Army, and amongst the Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the KGB, Committee for State Security, tried by every possible means to discredit and destroy the moral greatness of Stepan Bandera, state enemy number one amongst the population. By every means available, the NKVD, later the MVD, that is to say, the KGB, for years endeavored to liquidate Stepan Bandera, who lived in Munich under the name of Popel physically until finally on October 15, 1959, it succeeded in doing so. But even with this vile murder, Moscow did not succeed in breaking the will of But even with this vile murder, Moscow did not succeed in breaking the will to freedom of the Ukrainian people. Stepan Bandera became real symbol of Ukraine. He is the greatest hero for Ukrainian people. More than this, his legacy is very important for all progressive humankind. Stepan Bandera deeply respected all nations and cultures. He was struggling for the better future of all humankind. His great teaching should be enlightened all over the world. Legacy of Stepan Bandera is main source of Ukrainian strength and willingness for struggle against Russian invasion. That's why Russians are doing everything for blocking his name. The most enduring object of slander against the Ukrainian National Liberation Movement has been Stepan Bandera, who for many people remains a flag bearer and symbol of the struggle for Ukraine's national dignity and political independence. Bandera and his followers have been characterized variously as fascists, Hitlerites, collaborators, Nazis, etc. However, like Hetman Ivan Mazepa or Simon Petliura, Bandera has become part of Ukrainian political history. A symbol that is applied to anyone who was ever committed to the ideal of national independence. But all their satanic efforts will be futile and vain because they cannot close the light of Stepan Bandera's teaching. I'm sorry. So yes, I hope that this story touches your heart, and that all of us would come together and hope for a better world, for a peaceful world, and that the war would stop soon. And if you read the story of Stepan Bandera, you will see how Ukrainians fight for their freedom despite the numerous oppression. So I encourage everyone to really take time to study about Ukraine, read about the history of Ukraine, and support in every way that you can, because we all know that oppressing a country is never okay, and every country deserves its independence. I hope that we make peace and love, not war, because no one benefits and wins at war. So yeah, thank you for hearing the story, and I would also like to thank the Ukrainian NGO for giving me this opportunity to read the story of Stepan Bandera and record myself in a video. That would be all. Thank you once again. God bless.
Велику суть для усіх єдину